Friends, let me begin with a simple truth that you may not hear on mainstream television. Donald Trump is about to freak out. And not just because of the endless court cases, not just because of the political circus surrounding him, but because the very system he represents is unraveling before our eyes. The economic cracks that have been widening for decades are now splitting open, and no amount of slogans, rallies, or finger pointing is going to hold them together. That's what has Trump and, frankly, the entire political establishment terrified. Why do I say this? Because the American people are waking up. They are beginning to see that the problems they face, rising rents, unpayable debts, jobs shipped overseas, wages that can't keep up with inflation, are not accidents. They are not the result of a single bad politician or even one administration. They are baked into a system designed to serve corporations, the wealthy elite, and yes, the Trumps of this world, while leaving majority to scramble for scraps. And when people realize that, when they understand that their suffering is systemic, not personal, then the politics of distraction, blaming immigrants, blaming foreigners, blaming your neighbor, starts to lose its power. That's why Trump is going to freak out. Now, let's be clear. Trump didn't invent this system. He's just a particularly gaudy expression of it. But when he stands up and promises to make America great again, he is really promising to return to an era when working people accepted their exploitation as normal. That's the problem. The old normal isn't coming back. And the more he tries to sell nostalgia, the angrier he gets when reality refuses to cooperate. What's collapsing is not just Trump's personal brand, but the myth that capitalism in its American form can keep delivering prosperity to the majority. Trump's fear today is not simply the product of his court cases, his political rivals, or even the day-to-day drama that dominates the news cycle. His fear is systemic. It is rooted in a deeper unraveling of the very economic order he has always embodied, benefited from, and projected as a model of American success. And when the system itself begins to tremble, those who have built their identities and fortunes upon it tremble as well. That is why Trump's outbursts, his anger, his relentless blame shifting are not only personal expressions of frustration, they are signals of a ruling class in panic, a class watching its foundations erode in real time. Think for a moment about how Trump's image has been constructed over the decades. The gold-plated buildings, the casinos, the art of the deal, all of it rests on the myth of American capitalism as a system that rewards ambition, hustle, and vision. Trump is not just a politician. He is the walking advertisement of that ideology. He is the promise made flesh. If you work, if you dream, if you push, the system will deliver. Now imagine what it means when millions of Americans no longer believe that promise. When workers see their wages flatline for 40 years while costs rise relentlessly, when families find that two incomes are still not enough to afford rent or health care, when students graduate with debts larger than their parents' mortgages, suddenly the promise starts to look like a scam. And when the promise looks like a scam, the salesman looks like a fraud. Here's the hook. Trump cannot survive politically if people stop believing in the dream he sells, because that dream is not his invention. It is the ideological glue that holds the entire system together. His persona depends on the illusion that capitalism is still delivering for ordinary Americans. But the facts are catching up with the fantasy. Productivity has soared since the 1970s, yet wages have barely budged. Corporate profits hit record highs, yet household debt now weighs down nearly every generation. This isn't about one man failing. It's about the system itself being exposed as incapable of sustaining the lives of the majority. And when the mask slips on the system, the mask slips on Trump too. That is why he freaks out. You see, Trump has always known how to turn personal failures into political assets. A bankrupt casino becomes a story of grit. A lawsuit becomes proof he's fighting the deep state. He thrives on crisis when it can be spun as someone else's fault. But what he cannot spin away is the simple reality that more and more Americans understand their pain is not caused by an immigrant, not caused by a foreign competitor, not caused by some cultural conspiracy. Their pain is systemic. It is the inevitable product of an economy designed to concentrate wealth at the top while offloading risk and instability onto the many. Once that realization spreads, Trump's scapegoating loses its edge, and that is the nightmare for him and for every defender of the status quo. Consider how often he lashes out at the idea of socialism, workers' rights, or any alternative to the system as it stands. Why such fury? Because the real threat is not a single opponent in the next election. The real threat is a collective awakening, a movement of millions who finally see through the distractions. Trump feels the tremors of that awakening, and because he is so tied to the old myth of capitalism as endless opportunity, he must react with fury, denial, and fear. His freakouts are not just about saving his personal empire, they are about defending a collapsing ideology. And that is the deeper story here. Trump's personal anxieties mirror the systemic anxieties of the class he represents. His anger is the anger of a system losing legitimacy. His fear is the fear of elites who sense that the old tricks are not working, that the slogans have lost their magic, that people are no longer buying what is being sold. That, more than any lawsuit or election poll, is why Donald Trump is going to freak out. Americans are waking up, and that awakening is the most profound shift shaking our politics today. For decades, people were told that their struggles were personal, that if they just worked harder, got more education, or made smarter choices, they could escape their difficulties. That narrative kept the focus on individuals, not on the system. It allowed leaders, employers, and politicians to avoid responsibility by framing inequality as a matter of personal failure rather than systemic design. But the ground is shifting. More and more Americans are realizing that the crises they face, whether it is stagnant wages, unaffordable housing, student debt, or disappearing healthcare coverage, are not random misfortunes. They are structural. They are the predictable outcomes of an economic order tilted heavily toward the wealthy and corporations at the expense of everyone else. Here's the hook. Once people see the pattern, they can no longer unsee it. A family in Ohio loses their home to foreclosure when a graduate in California finds herself drowning in loans, when a factory worker in Michigan watches jobs shipped overseas, and when a single mother in Florida pays half her income in rent. They may think at first that these are isolated struggles, but when they begin to recognize that these struggles are shared by millions, replicated across regions and demographics, the story changes. What was once seen as a personal burden now becomes evidence of a broken system. That realization is powerful. It transforms despair into anger and anger into potential action. Trump and many others in power sense this shift. That is why they are desperate to redirect people's frustrations elsewhere. They tell us to blame immigrants, to fear China, to resent government programs that might actually help working people. These distractions serve a purpose: to keep the American people from identifying the true source of their pain. Because if the public ever fully grasps that their suffering is systemic, that it is not about them as individuals, but about the rules of the economic game itself, then the old strategies of division and scapegoating will no longer work. That is what terrifies those in power. Think about the younger generations. Surveys show that large numbers of young Americans now view socialism more favorably than capitalism. This is not because of abstract theory, but because of lived experience. They have grown up watching their parents lose homes during the financial crisis. They themselves carry massive student debts, and they know that job security and pensions, the staples of earlier generations, are out of reach. They look at the system and see it failing them. This is not ideology imposed from above. It is an awakening from below, born out of harsh reality. And once that awakening takes hold, it spreads quickly. Another hook: awakening is contagious. When workers share their stories, when tenants organize against rent hikes, when indebted students demand relief, they discover that their experiences are not isolated. They find community in struggle. That collective recognition is precisely what elites fear most, because once millions realize that their problems have common roots, they also realize that their solutions must be collective, not individual. They begin to question not only particular policies, but the structure of the system itself. And that questioning opens the door to possibilities that were once dismissed as unthinkable. Universal health care, strong unions, publicly owned utilities, or cooperative enterprises. For Trump, this is especially dangerous. His entire political strategy depends on presenting himself as the answer to individual grievances. He tells the farmer, the worker, the small town resident that he alone understands their pain. But if those same people come to see their pain as systemic as shared, then one man's promise cannot resolve it. They stop looking for a savior and start looking for solidarity. At that moment, Trump's political magic begins to fade. This is why you see such ferocity in the culture wars, such anger in the speeches, such constant attempts to pit one group against another. Those are tactics of distraction aimed at slowing the awakening. But history shows us that once people see the system for what it is almost impossible to put that awareness back in the bottle. You cannot convince people who are drowning in debt that everything is fine. You cannot tell a generation living paycheck to paycheck that the system is working as designed, because they know it is, and that is the problem. What we are witnessing is not just discontent, it is the beginning of a consciousness shift. Americans are learning to name their struggles not as personal failings, but as the outcomes of an economic system designed for the few. That shift is powerful. It explains why elites, including Trump, are on edge, because when people awaken to systemic truths, they begin to demand systemic change. And that, more than any election result, is what threatens the existing order. Trump's entire political identity has been built on the promise of returning America to a past glory, a supposed golden age when jobs were secure, wages could support a family, and communities seemed more stable. That is the essence of Make America Great Again. It is a politics of nostalgia, a longing for an earlier time when working people accepted their place in the system without questioning the fairness of that system. But here is the problem. The old normal is not coming back because the economic and social conditions that sustained it are gone. Trump's failure to recognize that fact is why his rhetoric grows more desperate and why his politics lean so heavily on anger and scapegoating. He is selling a dream that reality will not deliver, and that gap between promise and experience is widening every day. Here's the hook: nostalgia is powerful, but it is also dangerous. It appeals to memory, to emotion, to a sense that life used to be simpler and more secure. Yet nostalgia always hides as much as it reveals. When Trump invokes the past, he speaks to a time when wages were higher relative to living costs, when one income could support a household, when manufacturing jobs provided stability. But what he does not mention is that this era was built on conditions that cannot be replicated: an industrial economy before globalization, a dominant United States unchallenged by rising economies abroad, and a system where entire groups of people, particularly women and minorities, were excluded from full participation. That greatness rested on inequalities that are no longer sustainable, both inside the country and globally. Trump's freakout comes from the fact that people are slowly realizing the gap between his promises and their actual lives. Consider the worker in the Midwest who believed that Trump would bring back factory jobs. A handful may return, but automation and global supply chains mean that most never will. Think about the family that hoped for relief from medical costs, only to see insurance premiums and drug prices continue to rise. These lived experiences undermine nostalgia politics because they show that the past cannot be recreated, no matter how loudly it is promised. And when people recognize that, the spell of nostalgia begins to break. Another hook: nostalgia politics thrives only when people do not interrogate it. The moment they ask, why can't we make America great again? The answers reveal themselves in the structural shifts of capitalism. Corporations move production overseas to maximize profits, leaving workers behind. The wealth generated by rising productivity went overwhelmingly to the top 1%, leaving the majority with stagnant wages. Housing and healthcare were financialized, turned into profit centers rather than human rights. These changes are not the fault of one politician, nor can they be reversed by another. They are systemic. And because they are systemic, no return to the past is possible. That is why Trump grows angrier as he doubles down on nostalgia. He must distract from the fact that he cannot deliver what he promises. He cannot change the global economy to what it was in 1950. He cannot restore the dominance the United States once held when its competitors lay in ruins after World War II. He cannot rebuild the illusion of prosperity for all because the system today is designed differently. And so when reality resists nostalgia, Trump lashes out at immigrants, at foreign nations, at political opponents, hoping that anger can cover the emptiness of the promise. This is where the real danger lies, when nostalgia collides with reality and people see that promises are not being fulfilled. A leader like Trump needs new scapegoats to maintain support. That is why his politics lean into fear, division, and resentment. He tells his followers that someone, somewhere, has stolen the greatness they deserve. It is not the corporations, not the billionaires, not the system. It is the migrant worker, the rival nation, the activist, the journalist. This strategy works only as long as people cling to the hope that maybe, just maybe, greatness can be restored. But as more people confront the impossibility of going back, the strategy begins to collapse. The hook here is that America's future depends not on returning to a past that no longer exists, but on building something new. That is precisely what nostalgia politics seeks to prevent. Trump's entire appeal rests on convincing people that the answers lie behind us rather than ahead. But when Americans realize that clinging to the past keeps them trapped in the failures of the present, nostalgia will lose its grip. That realization is what Trump fears most. because it reveals the hollowness of his promise and the bankruptcy of the system he represents. The economic mask is slipping, and that is perhaps the most dangerous truth for those in power. For years, the system could disguise its failures with slogans about opportunity, stories of exceptional individuals who made it big, and promises that tomorrow would always be better than today. That mask of endless growth, of shared prosperity, of capitalism as the great equalizer was worn so convincingly that many believed it. But the disguise only works as long as the lived reality of ordinary people does not contradict it. Now, everywhere you look, the contradictions are unavoidable. People are living through a daily reminder that the story no longer matches their experience. And once that recognition spreads, the mask can never be put back on. Here's the hook: every stagnant paycheck, every skyrocketing rent bill, every new layer of student debt is like a hand tugging at the mask, tearing it loose from the face of the system. For decades, the official narrative was that if you worked hard, you would succeed. Yet millions now work 2 or even 3 jobs and still cannot cover basic costs. The narrative was that education was the path to a better life, but millions of young Americans graduate into debt burdens that chain them down before they even begin. The narrative was that America had the best healthcare system in the world, but medical debt is now one of the leading causes of bankruptcy. Each of these realities is a crack in the mask, exposing the truth beneath. Trump, of course, cannot allow that truth to stand unchallenged. His role is to insist that the mask is still real, that prosperity is just around the corner, that greatness is only a matter of defeating the right enemies. But people's lived experience is harder to manipulate than a campaign slogan. When month after month the rent goes up, but wages stay the same, when groceries cost more while executives cash record bonuses, it becomes impossible to reconcile the story of shared prosperity with the facts of daily survival. This is why Trump grows louder and more erratic, because the louder the mask slips, the more desperate the defense of illusion must be. Another hook: the cracks in the mask do not just reveal the failures of policy, they reveal the failures of the system itself. It is not that one president or one party has mismanaged the economy. It is that the economy is designed to serve capital over labor, profit over people, shareholders over workers. Once people begin to see that clearly, the debate shifts from fixing individual policies to questioning the entire structure. And questioning the structure is precisely what elites, including Trump, fear most. They know that if Americans start asking, why is it this way? Who benefits from my suffering? What alternatives exist? Then the conversation moves beyond personalities and parties and into systemic transformation. The history of capitalism shows us that it has always relied on a mask. In the 19th century, it wore the mask of manifest destiny. In the 20th, it wore the mask of the American dream. In the 21st, it tried to wear the mask of innovation and global leadership. Each mask promised that the hardships of the many were temporary, that the rewards were just over the horizon. But what happens when people no longer believe in the horizon? What happens when the future looks worse than the past for entire generations? At that point, the mask is not just slipping, it is falling to the ground. Trump is particularly vulnerable in this moment because he himself is a symbol of the mask. The gold-plated lifestyle, the television fame, the projection of success, these are all expressions of the idea that capitalism rewards the bold and the ambitious. But when people see that his wealth was built on inherited privilege, failed ventures, and tax loopholes, the illusion of meritocracy unravels. His personal story becomes a metaphor for the system itself, glitzy on the surface, hollow underneath. That is why he lashes out when challenged, because to question him is to question the mask he represents. Here's the critical point. Once the mask slips, it cannot be put back in place without force, distraction, or repression. That is why we see the rise of culture wars, the targeting of vulnerable groups, and the constant drumbeat of fear. These are not random outbursts. They are deliberate attempts to replace economic truth with social division. If people are arguing about who belongs in which bathroom, they are not talking about who owns their workplace. If people are fighting over what books children read, they are not asking why billionaires avoid taxes while public schools crumble. The mask may be slipping, but Trump and his allies will do everything in their power to keep attention away from what lies underneath. And so the task for ordinary Americans becomes clear: to resist distraction, to hold the mask in their own hands, and show others what lies beneath. Because once enough people see the face of the system exposed, the old illusions cannot be restored. And that, more than any election outcome, is what terrifies Trump and the class he represents. Trump's greatest fear is not a Democratic opponent, not a prosecutor, not even the possibility of losing an election. His deepest fear is that Americans will connect their struggles, recognize their common roots, and awaken to the truth that their pain is systemic. For decades, the power of the ruling class has rested on keeping people isolated, each person believing their hardship is unique, their frustration is personal, their suffering is the result of their own mistakes. But when millions begin to see that their burdens are shared, that they are all products of the same economic design, then the potential for collective action emerges. And once collective action becomes possible, the dominance of elites like Trump becomes deeply vulnerable. Here's the hook: fear thrives in isolation, but power thrives in solidarity. A worker who believes their stagnant wages are due to laziness will never question the employer who keeps the profits. A tenant who thinks rising rent is just bad luck will not demand accountability from landlords or developers. A graduate who blames themselves for student debt will not challenge the financial system that profits from it. Isolation keeps people divided and ashamed, unable to see their suffering as political. But when workers, tenants, and students look around and realize they are all experiencing the same struggles, they begin to understand that the issue is not individual, it is structural. That realization is electrifying, and it terrifies Trump. He knows that his political strategy depends on keeping people fragmented, turning them against each other rather than uniting against the system. That is why his speeches are saturated with scapegoats, immigrants stealing jobs, China destroying industry, minorities demanding too much, activists threatening order. Each scapegoat is a tool designed to redirect anger away from the real source of hardship, the structure of capitalism that concentrates wealth at the top while leaving everyone else fighting over scraps. As long as people are divided, the system is safe. But when they begin to connect the dots, the distractions lose their power. Another hook: collective awakening changes the meaning of politics itself. When people see their struggles as systemic, they stop looking for saviors and start building movements. Trump thrives in a politics of saviorism, where he alone can fix it, where he alone speaks for the forgotten man. But once the forgotten men and women realize they can speak for themselves, act for themselves, and organize together, the appeal of a strong man fades. The greatest challenge to Trump is not a rival candidate, but a population that no longer needs him. Look at the signs already appearing. Workers are organizing strikes in industries once thought unshakable. Renters are forming associations to fight back against landlords. Young people are questioning whether capitalism itself can deliver a livable future. Each of these is a step toward collective awareness, and each step is another reason for Trump to panic, because he understands that once collective awakening gains momentum, it is hard to stop. It spreads from workplace to workplace, from campus to campus, from city to city. It builds confidence in ordinary people that they are not alone, that their struggles are part of something larger. The ruling class has always feared this moment. That is why history is filled with efforts to divide workers by race, immigrants from natives, men from women, one religion from another. Division is the oldest tool of control. Trump is simply the loudest and most theatrical practitioner of it in our time. But what he cannot control is the growing recognition that division is a trick, that it serves only those who already hold power. And when that recognition takes root, no amount of scapegoating can undo it. Trump's freakouts, then, are the public face of a deeper panic, the fear that Americans will no longer be fooled. He senses the shift. He knows that every protest, every union drive, every demand for health care or housing is not an isolated complaint, but a piece of a larger awakening. He knows that once people see themselves as part of a collective struggle, they will no longer fall for the myth that their suffering is the result of personal weakness or bad choices. That myth has sustained the system for decades, but its hold is weakening. The most dangerous opponent Trump faces is not a rival politician, but an awakened public, because an awakened public cannot be easily lied to, cannot be endlessly distracted, and cannot be manipulated into turning on itself. That awakening is not just political, it is economic, it is social, it is human, and it is already underway. Trump's fear is that once Americans realize their struggles are shared, they will act on that knowledge. And when they do, his role as the great divider will collapse. The United States stands at a crossroads, and that choice is sharper today than it has been in generations. On one path lies the continuation of inequality, division, and despair, a system where the wealth of a tiny minority grows without limit, while the vast majority fight harder just to keep their heads above water. On the other path lies the possibility of something new, a system that places human needs above corporate profits, that values democracy over elite control, and that builds solidarity instead of sowing division. This is the real debate ahead. It is not about one man or one election cycle. It is about which direction this society will choose as its future. And that is exactly the debate that figures like Trump are desperate to prevent from taking center stage. Here's the hook. Every rising rent check, every unpaid medical bill, every student loan statement is a reminder that the status quo is not working. People feel this in their bones, in their daily struggles, and yet they are constantly told the only choices available are the ones already failing them. Trump and his counterparts in the political establishment want to keep the conversation framed around personalities, scandals, or cultural skirmishes, because once the focus shifts to systemic choices, the old narratives collapse. When the question becomes, do we want a society that serves the many or the few? The answer is clear, and it exposes how shallow the distractions have been all along. The ruling class, whether wearing a red tie or a blue one, insists that the system only needs small adjustments, or subsidies here, a tax break there, perhaps a new trade policy, or another round of deregulation. But these are not solutions. They are patches on a sinking ship. The American people are starting to recognize that tinkering at the edges will not resolve the crises they face. You cannot patch a system that produces debt for one generation after another. You cannot tweak your way out of a healthcare system designed to enrich pharmaceutical companies and insurers at the expense of patients. You cannot solve a housing crisis when homes are treated primarily as commodities for investors rather than places for families to live. These are not policy glitches, they are features of the system itself. Another hook, the choice is not between chaos and stability, as Trump often frames it. The choice is between clinging to a system that guarantees instability for the majority or daring to build one that delivers security for all. When people begin to realize that endless inequality is not inevitable, that alternatives exist and have existed in other times and places, then the old scare tactics lose their bite. Trump can shout about socialism all he wants, but the word loses its sting when people are already experiencing the failures of capitalism in their everyday lives. It is not ideology that pushes them toward change, it is necessity. This is why Trump's rhetoric is so fierce. He knows that if the American people ever frame their political choices in terms of systems rather than personalities, he and those like him will have nothing left to offer. He thrives in a politics of distraction, where voters argue over who said what or which scandal dominates the headlines. But he has no answers to the deeper questions. Why is it that the wealth of billionaires skyrocketed during a pandemic while millions lost their jobs? Why is it that the richest country in the world cannot guarantee health care to all its citizens? Why is it that housing, education, and retirement, the basic pillars of a dignified life, are slipping out of reach for ordinary families? These questions cut through the distractions and force a confrontation with the system itself. And here lies the opportunity. When people begin to see the choice clearly, when they recognize that it is not about returning to some mythical past or managing decline, but about building something entirely new, then the politics of fear loses its grip. That is why those in power work so hard to keep the terms of debate narrow. They want Americans to believe that the best they can hope for is a slightly kinder version of the same system, a slower decline instead of a faster one. But the awakening we see today suggests otherwise. People are beginning to demand real alternatives. And with those demands comes the possibility of genuine transformation. Trump is going to freak out because he senses this shift. He knows that if the American people fully embrace the choice before them, continuing the old order of inequality or building a new one of solidarity, then his politics of nostalgia and division will have no place. His fear is not just of losing power, but of losing the narrative that keeps the system intact. And once that narrative collapses, once Americans understand they have the power to choose a different future, then no amount of bluster can hold back the tide. So, my friends, let us step back and see the bigger picture. Trump's outbursts, his endless anger, his desperate distractions, these are not random theatrics. They are the visible signs of a system in crisis. He freaks out because the mask of American capitalism is slipping. He freaks out because nostalgia no longer convinces a generation burdened with debt and despair. He freaks out because Americans are waking up, connecting their struggles, and realizing that their pain is not personal, it is systemic. And most of all, he freaks out because the debate is shifting away from personalities and toward the system itself, toward the choice between continuing on a path of inequality or daring to build something new. Here's the hook. When people stop believing in the illusions, when they see the patterns for what they are, no leader, no billionaire, no Trump can put the genie back in the bottle. That awakening is the real story. That is the power the ruling class fears most. Because once people grasp that their struggles are collective, they begin to demand collective solutions. Solutions that put people over profit, democracy over corporate power, solidarity over scapegoating. So, yes, Trump is going to freak out, but his fear, his rage, his endless theatrics, they are not just about him. They are the panic of a system losing its grip, of an order that knows its time is running out. And our task is not to be distracted by the noise of his meltdown, but to focus on the opportunity it reveals. A new future is not only possible, it is necessary, and it will come, not from above, but from the millions of us who are ready to take back the power to shape an economy that works for all, not just for the few.